Cinema has given us some seriously iconic movie characters over the years, sometimes in the same film together. However, in some cases, those famous iconic film characters barely share the screen, even when audiences may think otherwise. Some of the characters on this list hardly shared a word between them, while others didn't speak at all. And while there was a clear reason for this in a lot of cases, others, frustratingly, are at the other end of that spectrum. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and let's take a look at these huge movie characters who barely spoke to each other. Starting with Happy and Virginia, Happy Gilmore 2. When a character returns after so many years, and in Happy Gilmore's case, decades, there is always going to be some intrigue as to how far they have come in that time, and what they are doing in the present. Happy Gilmore 2 went out of its way to put Adam Sandler's titular character as close to where he was at the very beginning as quickly as possible. Though Happy Gilmore 2 reveals that he now has 5 children, he was also forced to learn the game of golf from scratch again, with barely a penny to his name, and without Virginia by his side. Julie Bowen returned for the Legacy sequel, but was shockingly killed off after just 3 minutes and just one conversation, sending her husband to absolute rock bottom. They discussed retirement, with Virginia echoing once again the sentiment that Happy wasn't done with golf, and moments later she was killed by one of his tee-off shots. The dynamic between Happy and Virginia was one of the best things about the original Happy Gilmore, so to see the sequel actively throw it away so quickly was genuinely surprising. She may have posthumously spoken to her husband from his happy place, but even counting this, the two could have and should have had so much more time together. Caesar Flickerman and Claudius Templesmith, The Hunger Games. A big part of what makes the Hunger Games so disgusting is how it is viewed by the people of the capital. This fight to the death between 24 children is seen as a sport, the kids in question barely viewed as human, and arguably the epitome of this is Caesar Flickerman. The enigmatic host and MC of the entire thing has been portrayed brilliantly over the years by Stanley Tucci, with Kieran Culkin set to take over for Sunrise on the Reaping. And you could argue that the larger-than-life character needed no one else to bounce off when commentating on the games. And yet in the novels, he had Claudius Templesmith as something of a partner and co-commentator, a role that made it to the big screen for barely a moment. While Caesar typically appeared solo, he was joined on 1 or 2 random occasions by Templesmith, played by Toby Jones. It was odd for such a small role to be filled by someone like Jones, who could have given a wonderful performance opposite Tucci. In the role as it was, however, with as little as he actually interacted with his commentary partner, he honestly may as well have been left out altogether. Malcolm and the Colonel, War for the Planet of the Apes. As the Planet of the Apes trilogy put Andy Serkis's Caesar front and center, with Noah taking over for Kingdom, each of the 4 outings has had a different main human protagonist, and somewhat bizarrely, none of them ever met each other on screen. Will essentially set the entire apocalyptic virus into motion and was killed between the events of Rise and Dawn. While of course Freya Allen's May, who featured in Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, didn't appear until generations after her human predecessors. There could have been some crossover between Dawn's Malcolm and War's Colonel, however. As it was, Malcolm disappeared without a trace after the events of the second film, with the Colonel taking the reins in War. But there was almost a moment in which the former's absence was explained. It was something originally in the script, though was ultimately never filmed, leaving arguably the only 2 human leads who could have interacted kept apart. The scene would have shown the Colonel explaining to Caesar that Malcolm came to him, imploring him to find the ape leader and make peace. Of course, Woody Harrelson's character was never going to go in for that, and so he killed him where he stood. Black Widow and Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War. Bucky Barnes may be one of the most familiar characters in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, but back in 2014, his return from the dead was jaw-dropping. It was Natasha Romanoff who first told Captain America about the legend of the titular Winter Soldier, but their history was never explored after this. 5 years earlier, while on a job in Iran, Black Widow and the Winter Soldier crossed paths, with the latter scarring the future Avenger with a bullet. They fought a little throughout Captain America the Winter Soldier, but there were 2 more golden opportunities for this slice of the past to be uncovered. By the time of Avengers Infinity War, there perhaps wasn't enough time to lend to a conversation between Bucky and Natasha, even though they were right there with each other in Wakanda. Arguably the best time for them to have shared some meaningful dialogue would have been Captain America Civil War, but again, their paths only fleetingly crossed. In the third Captain America film, Nat asked him to recognize her during their brief fight scene, but there was no reference to their past made between them. As important as the two characters were to both the story and to Steve Rogers himself, it surely wouldn't have been too hard to bring them together for something of an apology, in a similar way to what he was doing at the start of Falcon and the Winter Soldier on Disney+. Truman and Sylvia, The Truman Show. It certainly isn't the type of role you'd chalk up as Jim Carrey's typical style, though there were a few moments where his signature mannerisms came through. But Truman Burbank, to this day, may still be the best role the actor has played. As a look at reality TV, it was ahead of its time, and it was incredibly emotional as the man was stuck in a fake world without even knowing it. The only thread he had to pull on was Lauren, real name Sylvia, dropping him infuriatingly vague hints before being carted away from him. She is one of the most important characters in the whole thing, and she is barely seen. She made a brief appearance in Truman's adolescent years in which they shared a little more than a run on the beach together, but that's it. That's not much reason for the married Truman to still be obsessed with her after so many years. It's slightly different for Sylvia, as she could still watch the show every day, but what made the girl Truman had a crush on a decade earlier so magnetic that he still not only thought about her, but actively tried to make up her face from magazine cuttings? It wasn't the hints of a fake world, as they weren't pursued until his father returned years later. It was her, and he barely knew her. Cobra Bubbles and the Grand Councilwoman, Lilo and Stitch. Live-action Disney remakes rarely take too much into consideration other than just how much the proverbial cash cow can be milked. But even set against such a low bar, has any reimagined classic missed the point of the original so much as 2025's Lilo and Stitch? A number of important aspects that made the film so beloved were altered, but arguably none more so than Cobra Bubbles. The joke was taken away from his name, his entire role in the story was changed, and his interaction with the Grand Councilwoman at the conclusion was reduced significantly. That's not to say that the two had a huge amount to say to each other in the original Lilo and Stitch, but they did have a brief conversation first about how they met back in Roswell in 1973, and then about Stitch staying on Earth. They shared a small moment of how such an act would cause both of them difficulty, which meant all the more that they were both happy to do it. In 2025, all Bubbles had to say to the Grand Councilwoman was that he gave his word that he would keep their secret, something that should have realistically held little sway considering that she believed he would do the exact opposite literally 2 seconds earlier. Just another nuance missed in a live-action remake. Bruce Banner and Thunderbolt Ross, Avengers Infinity War. Thanks to the sheer size of the film and the unprecedented cast list, there were always going to be characters that didn't interact in Avengers Infinity War quite as much as may have been hoped. The Guardians were kept largely isolated save for a handful of heroes. Iron Man and Captain America never crossed paths, and Hawkeye and Ant-Man were left out altogether. All of this was by design, and for the most part worked to great effect. However, what about two characters with a quite literally explosive past who shared the same rooms, sort of, but not a word between them? After William Hurt's Thunderbolt Ross spoke first to Don Cheadle's Rhodey, then the fugitive Secret Avengers by way of technology that allowed him to essentially be in the room, a mere 30 seconds after Colonel Rhodes hung up on him, Bruce Banner appeared. Again, this may have been by design, as Bruce likely wanted little and less to do with seeing Ross, but hell, the audience would have wanted to see it. The two were mortal enemies for a long time, and throw Betty Ross into the equation as Thaddeus' daughter and Bruce's one-time love, and it's a dynamic that was screaming for even just the slightest of acknowledgements. No, not every character could speak to every character, but they were right there, just half a minute apart. Bill Ferguson and Stephen Lockjaw, one battle after another. The works of Paul Thomas Anderson have received an impressive 11 Academy Award nominations over the years, and incredibly, none have actually brought home the statue. Yet again, it is widely believed that his work will be recognised by the Oscars this year, although it may now be the time for him to finally win his first. One Battle After Another is a popular pick for Film of the Year in 2025, and it's not hard to see why. Everything was outstanding, and it featured one of the most genuinely adrenaline-pumping car chase scenes of all time. That's not even mentioning the cast. It's quite ironic that both Leonardo DiCaprio and Sean Penn put in some of the best work of their respective careers, and will both likely receive Oscar nominations, and yet shared just one scene together. As good as the movie was, it almost feels like a rip-off, as more back and forth between these two would have been more than welcome. The one time they interacted was before they really knew who each other was, and it was still hilarious. Would just one more scene, particularly taking into account them both having loved the same woman, the question of the paternity of Bill's daughter, the fact that Lockjaw had been hunting him down for much of the film, and the sheer clash between their tones and personalities have been too much to ask? Michael Pearson and Fletcher, the gentlemen. Though typically thought of as the perfect British gentleman, typified by the likes of Bridget Jones's Diary, Notting Hill and Love Actually, Hugh Grant has spread his wings creatively in recent years. No one would have pictured him as an Oompa Loompa, and as Fletcher in The Gentleman, he played a character unlike any of his others. Fletcher, the absurdly skilled private investigator, was as greedy as he was talented, and proved to be a thorn in the side of Matthew McConaughey's Michael Pearson, the kingpin of the biggest drug operation in the country. Not only did he spill the beans on where Pearson could be found by Russian gangsters who wanted his blood, but he also tried to blackmail the man for £20 million before they found him. Only, the events of the film never actually show Fletcher interacting with Michael directly. Everything went through Michael's consigliere, Raymond. As one of the funniest and most compelling characters in the story, Fletcher shared some brilliant scenes with Raymond. But wouldn't it have been fun to see him face to face with Michael? The end of the movie teases McConaughey's character meeting Grant after Ray all but kidnapped him before he could flee the country. But exactly what happened after that, we will probably never know. DCI Chris Hudson and the Thursday Murder Club. The Thursday Murder Club. There was a lot of intrigue and excitement around Netflix's adaptation of The Thursday Murder Club when it released in 2025. Richard Osman's novel series was one of the hottest properties on the market, and with Chris Columbus and Steven Spielberg involved, as well as a more than stellar cast, what could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, it was the fact that a 2-hour runtime wasn't nearly enough to bring the story to life properly. Things felt rushed, and one character who undoubtedly suffered in this regard was DCI Chris Hudson. In the novels, Chris is a lovable police officer and reluctant friend of the Thursday Murder Club. Initially against having outside help from 4 geriatric nosy neighbours, as any police officer would be, Elizabeth, Joyce, Ibrahim and Ron eventually endeared themselves to Hudson. He began to see their value not only as help on his cases, but as people, which is kind of the entire point of the story. In the movie, however, much of Chris's involvement was cut. In spite of the wonderful casting of Daniel Mays, Chris simply didn't feature enough and didn't have enough time with the titular club. When the credits rolled, he had had little to no character development, and was seen almost as an antagonistic force against them, threatening arrest when he should have been celebrating with them. Corbin Dallas and Jean-Baptiste Emanuel Korg, the fifth element. It's not uncommon for films to keep their protagonist and antagonist apart for long stretches of the story, as it can brilliantly heighten the anticipation for when they finally come together. But they do usually come together, an aspect not shared by the fifth element. Luc Besson's movie is as crazy as it gets, even for a sci-fi romp set 300 years in the future, and there are far stranger things involved than not bringing the hero and the villain together. That being said, it is still odd to this day that Bruce Willis's Corbin Dallas never interacted with Gary Oldman's Korg. Dallas was an incredibly central part of the story, and even had everyone trying to be him in order to get to Floston and get their hands on the powerful MacGuffin stones. He was integral in defeating Jean-Baptiste Emanuel Korg, and he managed to do it without ever laying eyes on him. They were in and around each other in the hotel on Floston, and they missed crossing paths by a fraction of a second at one point, but were kept apart throughout the whole thing. It's hard to say what is more disappointing, the fact that Dallas and Korg never shared the screen, or that Bruce Willis and Gary Oldman never did. Captain Barbossa and Davy Jones, Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. For all that the big three of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise brought to proceedings, equally great were the villains they found themselves up against. Two of the best were, of course, Captain Hector Barbossa and Davy Jones, and it's a damn shame the two never truly interacted. Jones entered the franchise in the second film, just as Barbossa had been killed, though the latter was brought back to life by Tia Dalma, just in time to appear in At World's End along with his fellow bad guy. While Davy Jones, with his heart under the command of Lord Cutler Beckett, was at the spearhead of the East India Trading Company's armada, it was Barbossa who led the rebellion for much of the story. Of course, Jack, Elizabeth and Will played big parts as well, but if it wasn't for Barbossa pushing everyone forward to fight Jones, none of it would have happened. And yet the two opposing Legends of the Sea and monster villains of the franchise did not speak to each other. They shared a scene in which Barbossa, Elizabeth and Jack faced off with Jones, Beckett and Will, but even when stood directly opposite each other, not a single word was uttered between them. Even now, the tease for Jones's return has come just after Barbossa's noble sacrifice, and so it seems it will stay this way. Mark Hanna and Jordan Belfort, The Wolf of Wall Street. It must be nigh on impossible to steal a scene in any Martin Scorsese film, given the brilliance of every aspect at any given moment, particularly when sat opposite Leonardo DiCaprio. This, however, is exactly what Matthew McConaughey managed in 2011. The Wolf of Wall Street is remembered for many a thing, from DiCaprio's performance to the beginning of Margot Robbie's superstardom, and of course the general depravity involved. McConaughey's name is also on that list, and he managed to do it with just one scene and a handful of minutes. Mark Hanna had one lunch meeting with Jordan Belfort on screen and set him on the path to the person he would ultimately become. The chest beating, the humming, and the fact that you couldn't take your eyes off him, he was so damn compelling, making him a character that truly stood out in the film, and one that should have had more time. Yes, at least one more scene with Belfort, possibly at his height of success as a very different person to the one who had previously spoken to Hanna, would have been great. But just more screen time for the man in general would have been even better. Harry and Ray in Bruges. Though Martin McDonagh's beautifully dark comedy In Bruges is centred around three key characters, two of them barely interacted at all. Instead, Brendan Gleeson's Ken was something of a middleman between Harry and Ray, for the most part, as the one who knew both of them. Harry was the boss, while Ken brought Ray into the circle to do a job, namely an assassination. When this went wrong and Ray ended up accidentally killing a young boy, Harry wanted him dead. Had things gone to plan, he wouldn't have spoken to Ray at all, but he was forced to intervene. The two of them were caught in the final shootout together after Ken's death, and though they only shared the screen for a matter of moments, they were some of the funniest of the whole thing. The awkwardness and ridiculousness of their standoff against the incredibly dark nature of the story was genuinely laugh-out-loud hilarious. Harry ultimately put 4 bullets through Ray, and in all likelihood killed him. And though their scenes together made up the bulk of the compelling finale, you could argue that any more time between them would have taken away from the feeling when they did finally meet. Hannibal Lecter and Jack Crawford, The Silence of the Lambs. Just because two big characters don't interact with each other during a movie's events, that doesn't mean that they haven't done so before. In fact, it was made perfectly clear that Jack Crawford and Hannibal Lecter had spoken to each other before the events of Silence of the Lambs, something that only made the latter more intimidating. The two referenced each other multiple times to Jodie Foster's Clarice Starling, and when Jack told her to believe him that she didn't want Hannibal Lecter in her head, it was strongly suggested that he was speaking from experience. The theory throughout the film was that Jack sent Clarice as untested and inexperienced a prospective agent as he could find, not just because she was a woman, but because he could send her in there without giving her an agenda for the killer to sniff out. Making so many references to their past and keeping them apart for the events of the film not only drove home the intimidation factor of Hannibal, since even the head of the FBI's behavioral science unit was too scared to face him, but it allowed Clarice to shine in the role, something that was unmatched in helping to make the story as brilliant as it was. Luke, Leia and Han, the Star Wars sequel trilogy. The prospect of a new Star Wars trilogy a decade ago was just as exciting as it was before The Phantom Menace disappointed the world in 1999. This was a license to print money, and as such The Force Awakens earned a whopping $2 billion+ at the global box office. But there was a lot missing. The first in the new trilogy is easily the best, though not without its issues. One of the biggest being the return of the original trio. Yes, Han and Leia had their reunion, fleeting though it was, while Luke didn't appear at all until the very final scene of the film. So no reunion between Luke and Han, who died at the hands of his son before having the chance to speak with his old friend again. The Last Jedi brought Luke and Leia together, again for another fleeting moment before the former was killed following his battle with Kylo Ren. Yes, the big three came back, and yes, Leia had a meaningful moment with both Luke and Han, but the fact that Luke and Han themselves never came back together again, and that the full trio never shared the screen together across all 3 movies, is something that will never be forgiven by many a Star Wars fan. Sue Storm and Ben Grimm, Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four first steps may not have been as big a home run as could have been expected from the family's first appearance under the Marvel Studios banner, but there can be no denying it was light years ahead of 2015's Fantastic Four. You could pick absolutely any aspect of Fox's final attempt at getting Marvel's first family right and have a lengthy discussion about why it was so bad. And in this entry, it is the fact that at no point did they actually feel like a family at all. The worst example of this is the dynamic between Sue Storm and Ben Grimm. Typically, Ben is seen as just as much a brother to Sue as Johnny, and an integral part of the family. In Fantastic Four, however, he and Sue never actually properly met. He was out of shot when Franklin Storm introduced his daughter to Reed Richards, and she wasn't there when Reed called him in to travel to Planet Zero. Even after they got their powers, the two did not cross paths until the final battle pitted the Fantastic Four against Doom. And even then, they didn't speak. This was a result of the franchise trying to take the Fantastic Four into grim, no pun intended, and gritty Dark Knight territory, which is fundamentally against the entire fabric of the team. They weren't a family. Ben was essentially just tagging along as Reed's friend. Alan, Ellie, Ian, and Lewis Dodgson, Jurassic World Dominion. The Star Wars sequel trilogy isn't the only franchise to bring their original stars back to the screen for the first time in decades, and though most things said about Jurassic World Dominion are more than fairly critical, at least Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, and Ian Malcolm actually shared the screen together. Among the film's many downfalls, however, was how they interacted with another returning to the big screen for the first time since 1993, Campbell Scott's Lewis Dodgson. The character wasn't on camera much in the original Jurassic Park and was recast for Dominion almost 30 years later. But with his appearance, he brought an opportunity that was completely missed. The entire story that shifted the fact that dinosaurs were now roaming free into subplot territory was a whole missed opportunity in itself. But how could you bring back Lewis Dodgson and the original Big Three and not even once reference the fact that he was behind everything that happened on Isla Nublar all those years ago? It was Dodgson who paid Dennis Nedry to retrieve the dino embryos, who, in attempting to do so, shut all security systems down. Alan and Ellie came face to face with Dodgson a handful of times, but in no meaningful way. And Ian worked for the man during the film's events, and still nothing was mentioned. Legolas and Frodo, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When Lord Elrond put the titular Fellowship of the Ring together in Rivendell, by its very nature, it was a mix of all different races and backgrounds, from hobbits and dwarves to elves, men, and even a wizard. This shed hobbits into a whole new light to those involved, and advanced relations between the elves and the dwarves an immeasurable amount. But there were some dynamics that were barely ever touched on. Throughout the entire trilogy, from the moment Legolas pledged his bow to Frodo, he was not shown to speak to him again. If this were just a single film, that would be strange enough, as given the journey that they were on, you would have thought at least one conversation would have occurred. However, this is a trilogy, and though Frodo and Sam ultimately broke off from the Fellowship to head to Mordor alone, they did reunite before the end, and still, no word was spoken. Even when Frodo's companions visited him after being taken back to Rivendell, after he laughed with Gandalf and celebrated like mad with Merry Pippin and Gimli, there was just a smile between him and Legolas, and not a word uttered. And finally, Norman Osborn and Peter 2, Spider-Man No Way Home. Though there was an undeniable level of excitement surrounding Andrew Garfield's return in Spider-Man No Way Home, with the amazing Spider-Man himself absolutely stealing the show, it was Tobey Maguire who had the world brimming with anticipation more so. This wasn't just because of how beloved he was as Peter Parker, that his franchise was far more popular than that of Garfield, or even the thought of him interacting with the other Peters. There was also the fact that 3 of his major villains were also returning in Norman Osborn, Otto Octavius, and Flint Marko. Of course, Peter 2 didn't step through Ned's sling ring portal until halfway through the film, but he still managed to have a special moment with 2 of these villains. He was the one who delivered the cure to Sandman, and he caught up and called back to a decades-old conversation with Octavius in a real moment of nostalgic beauty. But with arguably his greatest nemesis of all time, the Green Goblin, he barely shared the screen. He was the one who pushed Earth-616 Peter to save him as well as the others, and he stopped Tom Holland's character from killing Willem Dafoe's at the story's conclusion. But even after that, and even after being stabbed by Osborn, they barely interacted outside of a blink and you'll miss it sideways glance that meant nothing. This was a huge wasted opportunity.